You're watching Narrify.
I met Sheila at a charity drive in Sacramento, where she handed out bottled water with a practiced smile and a quiet warmth that felt like a small, steady light in a messy world. She called herself a nurse in our first conversation. She said it like a badge of honor and a humble profession, and I loved that about her. How she leaned into care as if it were a second language she spoke fluently. We moved through dates that felt like the slow, natural folding together of two lives. Coffee at dawn, late walks down tree-lined streets, the kind of talk where you traded scars and dreams and felt closer after every secret dropped. When we married, it felt natural, inevitable. She promised me a life of steady routines and little rituals, and I, hungry for something real after years of half-loves and casual friends, gave everything I had without reservation. The first year was easy. The second year we began to build the house we'd always pictured, small renovations, and spreadsheets and arguments about paint swatches, the comfortable friction of people who were learning how to become a family. Then work got heavy for me and her night shifts started to stack. 3 nights, then 4, then shifts that swallowed a week like quicksand. A rhythm that, in retrospect, set the stage for everything. At first I was proud. How she juggled compassion and exhaustion. How she came home smelling faintly of antiseptic and dinner she'd heated up in the microwave. How she could fall asleep on the couch with a show left playing while I watched her and felt grateful to exist in the same small orbit. But the truth is that small gifts and late-night texts can mask a deeper distance. And for months I only noticed the shape of an absence, not its cause. People who work nights sometimes become other people. They learn the language of quiet corridors and hushed machines, and they carry home a tiredness that looks like a shadow. I thought I recognized that shadow, that wolfish tiredness, until the small hints began to accumulate. An unexplained sweater on the floor that smelled faintly of someone else's cologne. A charge on a bank statement labeled for a bodega I'd never been to. A carefully casual mention of staying late that turned into an entire night's disappearance. My first attempts to question it were soft, tentative probes designed to give her space to explain. Was your shift longer? Are you okay? Her answers were the same as always. Soothing, small, convincing. She would squeeze my hand with the same familiarity she had for years and say, "I'm fine." And I would believe her because believing is easier than the alternative. The one where trust crumbles and you are left looking at ruins you can barely name. The first truly suspicious thing was a photograph, blurry and grainy, sent to me by a mutual friend who didn't mean to hurt me. Sheila at the edge of a shadowed room, leaning too close to a man in scrubs who had his arm so casually around her shoulder, he might have been her husband. I opened the image and the world tipped. The man's smile was warm, his ID badge read, Dr. Collins. My stomach dropped while my head manufactured explanations. Night shift, a joke, a stretch of happenstance. But the photograph was a seed planted in soil that would soon grow into trees of proof. I confronted Sheila with the image and she laughed, soft and incredulous, claiming the man was a colleague celebrating a long surgery and that the photo was an angled trick. Her laugh was the perfect cover, and I wanted to be a believer again, so I swallowed my doubt. The second image came a month later. Sheila in a car with another doctor, hands clasped, faces turned toward the camera. But this time, the message had a caption that made my chest cave. Finally, time together. The friend who sent it insisted she only forwarded something she thought was harmless. I wrestled with anger and embarrassment and the sickening realization that my marriage, which had been built on small rituals and Sunday pancakes, might be built on a house of cards. The months that followed were a slow, relentless push into a truth I did not want. I began to notice the patterns like a detective reading an old case file. Certain doctors who always seemed to appear when Sheila's shift patterns changed. SMS threads that opened in the middle of the night and closed in the dawn. An attention to appearance that increased whenever she knew she'd be on shift. I started keeping receipts, logging times, photographing bank statements. Little acts that felt like armor, but were really just the frantic fumbling of a man trying to document a reality that his heart kept insisting couldn't be true. I spied because I was terrified, and the spying yielded more than suspicion. It proved that Sheila's nights were full of meetings and touches and laughter with men who introduced themselves as doctor, and treated her with a particular intimacy that, to me, was betrayal in the flesh. There were elaborate narratives, claims about loneliness and that the hospital staff was family, but the way those hands lingered, the private jokes, the evenings that ran long into clinical closings, they told a story that 1,000 soothing words could not erase. The final straw in that first act of discovery was not a photograph but a voicemail I found after hacking, shamefully, into a phone backup when her device was left unguarded. A hushed voice, male, low, saying how easy she made everything, thanking her for being understanding about his messy life. I played that voicemail until the edges of the audio wore smooth, and the truth reflected back at me was blank and merciless. I had loved a woman who had folded herself into other men's arms on nights when I counted her breaths as a comfort. Confrontation exploded like a small, terrible storm. She did not deny it in the way a liar denies. She tried to make me complicit instead, shifting blame, declaring my late work hours had made me absent, painting herself as the lonely worker seeking the human warmth. The night shift denied her. Her arguments were full of careful victimhood. They were convincing to people who didn't know the months of evidence I had been collecting. At first she begged, then she apologized, then she proposed counseling in a way that asked me to help her fix something she had been actively breaking, a paradox I could not reconcile. In that first period of ruin, love felt like a ledger where only her debts were counted. Each lie, each small betrayal, it seemed, could be justified by the exhaustion of stitches and code blues, and the hospital itself, its fluorescent corridors and the sick and the quiet after midnight, became both alibi and accomplice. I felt like a man who had been quietly edited out of his own life, replaced with this version of Sheila who kept one face for me and another for the night. I moved from suspicion into cold strategy because love could no longer be the map I trusted. I had to become precise and careful and cruel in the only way that would matter, gathering proof that would not bend under the sweet-tongued apologies she used to disarm me. I started by reconstructing her shifts, not because I wanted to control her days, but because I needed to see where her absences fit into a pattern. Once I matched the nights she stayed late with specific hospital rosters, I discovered a web of connections I could not have guessed. Certain attending physicians who were not just colleagues but friends, specific parking lot spots where she parked a second time during the nights I thought she was in the break room, quiet bars by the hospital, back door where the staff filed out laughing like a private company. I began leaving work early sometimes, feigning errands, so I could stand in the shadow of the hospital's darkened architecture and watch the flow of bodies, the nurses with their shoes off, the residents with their tired, scholarly faces, and the doctors who lingered where the cleaning carts stored their night coffees. What I found would have broken men with less grit. It broke me inwardly and made my hands steady. Lena, not a twin or some cinematic entanglement, but Sheila's friend and mentor among the night nurses, had once joked about being a matchmaker, and that dark joke had trodden into a real network of affairs. There were men who thought of themselves as bright stars in the hospital universe and women who needed that light to feel seen, and the system's steady machine of emergencies created opportunities for private comfort. I discovered under a table a lipstick cap that belonged to Sheila, a receipt for a hotel room in a town 40 minutes away, text threads where doctors scheduled coffee and catching up at 3 a.m., and the kind of photos that, in isolation, might be dismissed as friendly but in the accumulation of proof made the pattern undeniable. I hired, quietly and with shame I still feel, a private investigator, not because I trusted strangers with my grief, but because the evidence I had photographed into my phone needed corroboration. Time-stamped, irrefutable. The investigator returned with records that mapped meetings I had not accounted for. Hospital security footage that showed Sheila slipping down a back stair with a well-dressed resident at 2:14 a.m. Entry logs that revealed badge swipes that did not match her declared presence in the nurse's station, and an annotated ledger of dinners paid for on cards that later showed up in her wallet as team dinners. I printed everything and arranged it in a folder, each sheet a small incision into the neat lie of our domestic life. When I sat her down and opened the folder across from her, the room smelled like coffee and the air hummed with the sudden cruelty of certainty. She looked at the photos, the lines, the printouts of HMO transaction codes and then at me, and for a moment she was pale and paper-thin. "This is evidence," I said, my voice crumbling and then hardening, and she did not look away. Her defense was practiced and cold. She called it support, a long night with friends, companionship, She said it as if canny morality could remake every act into virtue, and she insisted I was being dramatic. Then she did something I had not expected. She admitted parts of it with the slow precision of a confession. She told me about the ego-driven flattery of some attending doctors, how they would compliment her in ways that became currency, how a hand on a back could be misread and then repeated until it was not misread at all. She named men. Dr. Collins, Dr. Herrera, Dr. Malik, the names punching me like a litany of betrayal. The night after I confronted her, the house that had once felt warm was a cold instrument. She left our bed, took a duffel, and told me she needed space to fix things. I watched the taillights vanish like final punctuation. The community heard fragments of the story and created its own narrative. Sheila, who had once been the quiet backbone of our life, now stood in the center of a moral theater where everyone wanted to pick a side. Colleagues murmured that the hospital had its romances and its tragedies. Our mutual friends asked if we were okay and then, when faced with the choice, slipped into silence that felt like betrayal. The deeper I dug, the stranger the complicity became. Some nurses who had once laughed with Sheila now kept their distance. Certain doctors continued to behave as if nothing had happened. The hospital administration, when I threatened revelation, was not swift but careful, promising to look into staff relations in ways that made me suspect their own protection of reputation over truth. I filed complaints to the hospital board. I delivered the folder to human resources and insisted on formal investigation. HR had a slow bureaucratic rhythm. They required signed statements, corroborating witnesses, and policies to interpret what private exchanges meant in professional terms. The hospital could not ignore allegations that involved physicians, their licenses, and potential malpractice of boundaries. When an internal audit began, the air around the night staff changed. Whispers, awkward smiles, and the sudden care of those who previously dismissed our marriage now felt like targeted cruelty. As the formal investigation advanced, some of the doctors I had seen in compromising positions were placed on leave pending review. Some nurses who had been close to Sheila stepped forward with their own recounting of late-night private calls and emotional support that had clearly crossed lines. I remember one particularly damning night when Dr. Collins's email to a colleague, found in the inbox the investigator had painstakingly poured through, read like an admission wrapped in plausible deniability. "We need to be careful, her husband is suspicious, but she's everything." Tonight, that line, written in professional language yet clearly intimate, became a piece of the mosaic that made the lie visible to others. Publicly, Sheila tried a different tactic: charm and contrition, soft words and interviews with HR, a tear in a hospital foyer while staff murmured about the pressure of night work. Privately, I watched a woman whose face I thought I knew stain it with different colors. Shame when privately questioned, anger when she thought I had gone too far, and an almost disbelieving contempt when she saw the world gather evidence as if it were some sudden plague. In one of those private moments, she told me to stop, to drop it, to think of how our son, if we had had one, would be affected by public scandal. She weaponized empathy, the same way she had once used humor to disarm me, making me feel cruel for exposing what I had been forced to find. This was part of her talent. She always knew how to make moral exposure feel like cruelty. But her craft had consequences. The investigation, slow and tortuous, finally produced results that could not be dismissed as mere spats between adults who worked nights. Evidence compiled by the hospital's legal team, together with my binder of receipts and the PI's footage, painted a picture of repeated boundary violations, texts that promised private meetings, payments that resembled gifts, after-shift rendezvous at hotels, and, most damningly, corroborating statements from an erstwhile friend who could no longer carry the weight of secrets. Facing the avalanche, several doctors chose to retire quietly. One took an administrative leave that ended in licensing review, and Sheila, my Sheila, found herself stripped of the easy credibility she had once commanded in our neighborhood. The day Human Resources called me to say they were suspending her and referring the case to the state board felt surreal. I had spent months acquiring proof because my heart could not bear the possibility of being mocked, and the machinery of accountability, slow and clumsy as it was, had finally found a gear to turn. The fallout was not clean and it was not swift. There were rumors, recriminations, legal threats, but when the hospital placed formal restrictions on those physicians and announced a review of staff conduct, the tenor of the town changed. People who had whispered now had to speak to the board, and the hospital had to respond not to social rumor but to documented patterns of misconduct. I watched the woman I loved in hearings, in HR rooms, in quiet conversations with lawyers, and though some part of me longed for the old warmth, another part felt a vindicated relief so hot it was almost shameful. In the end, consequences reached far enough. The doctors implicated faced disciplinary review and, in some cases, lost hospital privileges. Sheila was required to attend counseling and eventually was dismissed for breach of conduct and for behavior that undermined the trust required of clinical staff. Her professional reputation was not the only casualty. Our marriage, once a quiet canopy under which we had sheltered, was irreversibly frayed. Yet in that long season of hearings and slow moral accounting, I learned that exposure could heal a few things. It allowed me to stop pretending, to stop counting absences as innocent and to re-enter the world with the knowledge that my anger had teeth and that institutions could be compelled to act when enough proof was presented. The intensity of the second act ended not with a revenge fantasy but with a cold, procedural justice. The hospital took steps and I felt, for the first time in months, as if the world had acknowledged the harm done. When the dust settled, it did not look like the dramatic courtroom victory I had sometimes pictured in the darkest nights. It was procedural, bureaucratic, and at times painfully modest. A few revocations of privileges, settlement agreements, a public statement from the hospital about zero tolerance for boundary violations, and a private settlement with one doctor who agreed to resign rather than endure the public exposure of his actions. Sheila's dismissal was both professional and personal. She was removed from the schedule, lost the credentials that had defined a part of her identity, and the community that once welcomed her now treated her with a cool politeness that felt worse than anger because it was the social equivalent of being erased. Our neighborhood gossip became my new weather. Friends I had trusted became hesitant, and the people who had once invited us for barbecues now had to think about how to greet me without dredging the past. I did not get the easy catharsis of a scripted revenge. I did get legal letters from defense, attorneys asking me to consider confidentiality, drop the public narrative, and we will settle quietly. They offered number and terms. I refused politely in the beginning and then, after delays and the grinding fatigue of hearings, accepted a modest settlement to avoid further legal costs and the pain of a replayed life. The settlement was not victory. It was practical survival. Money to rebuild, a formal apology that never quite named the full extent of harm, and a stipulation that certain doctors would never again practice without additional oversight. What I gained most was freedom, the kind that arrives not from triumphant speeches but from the quiet ability to sleep without checking my phone for a message that contained another secret. People ask me now if I regret pressing charges, exposing the hospital, or taking evidence public. The answer is complex. I regret the way it hollowed out my sense of domestic comfort. I regret the nights where I replayed every scene and wished for different choices. But I do not regret the fact that the pattern was challenged, that the professional world learned to pay attention when private comforts morph into exploitation. Sheila left town quietly 6 months after the worst of it, moving to a small coastal city where she tried to make a new life. I heard later that she worked briefly in a clinic under supervision, that she attended therapy, that she sent a card apologizing once on a birthday and then not again. The apology itself was small and insufficient. Words that can't rewrite every time she slid into someone else's arms on a night when I counted on her for solace. I rebuilt my life not in a blaze but as a slow accrual of small things. An apartment with a kitchen where I could breathe, a job that paid, and a few friends who returned when the story cooled into memory. I learned to sleep again on nights I once would have spent waiting. I learned to trust the small rhythms of life rather than the grand gestures. In the quieter months, I started volunteering at a community center, trying to turn my story into something that might help other people detect the quiet erosion that can happen around hospitals and professions where the night bends time and relationships into strange shapes. If there is a moral here, it is not simply that betrayal should be punished. It is that exposure, when wielded carefully, can protect others from harm and bring institutions to a place of accountability they might otherwise avoid. I sometimes walk past the hospital and feel a brittleness, a memory like glass underfoot, and I watch doctors and nurses move in practiced ways and wonder at the complexity of their lives. I do not think of Sheila every day now. Memory has a way of softening, of rearranging itself into less jagged shapes. There are nights when an old smell will return my chest to a tightness and I will breathe through it and remember my own resilience. I survived a long betrayal and the slow work of unmaking it. The men who were implicated paid professional and reputational costs that, for some, were career-defining. The hospital instituted new policies about staff relationships and confidentiality, and training programs brought forward the need to separate personal entanglements from professional duty. The final scene of that long nightmare was not dramatic. It rarely is. There was no cinematic revenge, no triumphant return. There was a long, practical cleanup, counseling, rebuilding finances, quiet apologies, and, gradually, trust scraped together with the most ordinary of tools. Punctuality, honesty, small kindnesses that were consistent enough to be believable. In time, I found a gentler version of peace. Not the naive optimism of my younger days, but a reserved, hard-earned steadiness that allowed me to be present again in the world. I learned to see the night differently now, not as a place of betrayal alone, but as a place where work and care intersect, sometimes dangerously, and where communities must remain vigilant. If I could speak to anyone listening to this story, I would tell them to pay attention to small absences, to trust when your body signals that something is off, and to understand that exposure is a tool that can hurt but also heal. And in the deepest, most private part of me, there remains a hole that was made by someone I loved. I am tender about that wound, careful not to let it define me. The ending is not a bang but a closing of a long, difficult chapter. A life rearranged. A wife who once seemed inseparable now part of my past. And a quiet hope that the next person who trusts will be met with something kinder and truer.